Good evening, and welcome to the second of two videos on the respiratory system. So, in the first video, we talked mainly about the anatomy of the lungs and the alveoli and the various pieces and parts of the system. In this video, we're going to concentrate more on how it actually works. So, oftentimes we confuse breathing with respiration. All right. And I want to make very clear right at the outset that they're not necessarily the same thing. Um, the process of respiration actually takes place in different ways, which we'll get to later. But what we often think of as respiration is really just ventilation or the process of breathing. And there are two phases to this. All right. Inspiration, which is breathing in, and expiration, which is breathing out. Now, inspiration is an active process. All right. Think back. What does active mean? All right. Well, if you remember, it uh, anything that's active means that it requires energy. And inspiration requires the contraction of muscles, especially the diaphragm muscle that sits between your thoracic and abdominal cavities. And so this is an energy intensive process. Expiration, on the other hand, is a passive process. Although you can force it, you can blow air out. But usually, during the course of normal breathing, expiration is a passive process of exhalation that expels air out of the lungs. All right. So, inspiration and expiration, active and passive, respectively. Sorry. Okay. So, let's talk about this process of inspiration, this active process here. All right. The very first thing that happens is that two sets of muscles must contract. The first one is the diaphragm. And you'll notice here that the diaphragm initially starts out in almost a turtle shell kind of shape. And what it does is it moves downward. It kind of flattens out, and you can see it flattened much more flattened in this picture. All right. But in addition, there are also muscles inside the rib cage which also contract. And so what this does is the diaphragm flattens and the rib cage moves upward and outward. That's what those intercostal muscles do. Now, what this does is it increases the volume inside your chest cavity. All right. And therefore, the volume of that cavity, as well as the volume of the lungs, increases. Now, when that happens, the air pressure within the lungs decreases, right? Because if you have, let's say, if you have 2 gallons of air in a balloon, and then you stretch the volume of the balloon out to 3 gallons instead, what's going to happen? Well, more air is going to rush in from the outside, right? And so the same kind of thing happens here. The air pressure within the lungs decreases when the chest cavity expands and air rushes in. All right. And so we consider this to be an active process because it does require the contraction of the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm. In your middle school science classes, maybe even in high school, you probably built a little model of the lungs. There's a little membrane that you put over the top of a beaker, and with a balloon inside, and you manipulate the air pressure by moving a little lever, and you can see the balloon expand and contract and expand and contract as air around it is moved out of the beaker. Well, in this case, it's essentially the same thing. What you're doing is you're increasing the space inside the chest cavity, and nature abhors a vacuum. And so air rushes in your nose, through your mouth, and into your lungs, all right, in order to fill up that empty space, so to say. Now, once you're done with that and you're ready to breathe out, well, that's the process of expiration. All right. In this case, the muscles relax, and again, let me move my ugly mug here. The diaphragm and the intercostal muscles relax, and so what happens here is that the diaphragm moves back upward, and And you can see that here. So the diaphragm's moving back up, and the intercostal muscles relax, which causes the rib cage to shrink back down. And so that's the first set of steps here. All right. So the muscles relax, and the rib cage kind of contracts as this happens. When the rib cage moves downward and inward, the volume of the thoracic cavity then decreases. All right. The air pressure in the lungs then increases, right? Because now you got um, you know 3 gallons of air in a 2 gallon space. So what's going to happen? Well, a gallon of that air is going to get expelled. And so the air then flows out of the lungs. All right. But because it doesn't take any energy to relax those muscles, we consider this to be a passive process. All right. So inspiration and expiration. Now, you may have noticed that when I talked about this, I mentioned that we have 3 gallons of space, and then it decreases to 2 gallons, right? Well, doesn't the 2 gallons come out as well? And the answer is no. Actually, your breathing only exchanges a small portion of the air that's contained inside your lungs at any given time. All right. And so the graph on the bottom illustrates what happens, generally speaking. Now, your lungs can hold almost 6 liters of air, all right, 5,800 milliliters. But essentially, during each individual breath, you're only really exchanging about 500 milliliters of air up and down, up and down, up and down during normal breathing. All right. That's what we call the tidal volume. All right. It's just a small amount of air that moves in and out with each breath. Now, I'm not talking about taking deep breaths or blowing all your air out or that sort of thing. I'm just talking about normal breathing. Okay. Like you're doing as you're watching this video, although now you're thinking about it, so that may not be the case. Now, you can, however, expand your lungs all the way up to almost 6 liters from about 3 liters. So you can almost double. You can almost double the volume. All right, and that's the what we call the maximum inspiration. Big deep breath in. All right, and that volume is called the inspiratory reserve volume. If you then take that deep breath and blow it all out, like the big bad wolf and the three little piggies, all right, that's called the expiratory reserve volume.
It's 8 o'clock.
Well, thank you, Jesus. And that gives us what we call the vital capacity. That's this amount in here. And so this is the maximum volume of air that can be moved in, plus the maximum amount that can be moved out during one breath. Okay. So we've got the tidal volume, which is just this little piece in here, the vital capacity, which is the much bigger portion. Now, if you add, or if you subtract rather, the tidal volume out of the vital capacity, you're left with the inspiratory reserve volume, all right, and the expiratory reserve volume, okay? Now, notice that there's always just over a liter of air in your lungs. This is what's known as the residual volume. Your lungs never completely empty, all right? At least not while you're living. And so the air remaining in the lungs after exhalation is called the residual volume, all right? The residual volume. Okay. Now, your breathing is controlled by the nervous system. So how is breathing controlled by the nervous system? Well, there's a great little diagram over here, and you can see the portions of the brain. And the respiratory center is found in the brainstem, in a position or part of the brainstem called the medulla oblongata. I love that word, those words, don't you? It reminds me of the Lion King for some reason. I want to break out in song. Medulla oblongata. Never mind. Anyway, um, so the respiratory center is found in the brain. But notice that the brain, of course, is connected to the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is connected to a bunch of spinal nerves. Well, guess what? All those spinal nerves, well, not all of them, but some of those spinal nerves are connected to the intercostal um, uh, muscles. All right. And so the medulla oblongata sends out nervous impulses that contracts the muscles for inspiration, not only the intercostal muscles, but also there's a special nerve called the phrenic nerve, which stimulates the diaphragm. All right. So the intercostal nerves stimulate the intercostal muscles, and the phrenic nerve stimulates the diaphragm. Now, some of you may have heard of a syndrome called SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. And this is thought to occur when this nerve center stops sending out signals for whatever reason. And scientists have been stymied for a long time. Doctors have been stymied about what actually causes this. A perfectly healthy baby is put down for the night and doesn't wake up. It's a terribly tragic thing, and they've gone through different stages of advice. Never sleep a baby on their back, never sleep a baby on their front, never sleep a baby on their side, and it has changed. The recommendations have changed over the years, and now they're saying on the back is the best way to put a baby down in its crib. In any event, but SIDS is believed to be caused by an issue with the medulla oblongata sending the signals to the phrenic nerve and the intercostal nerves. Now, there's also a chemical control of breathing. All right, there are two sets of chemoreceptors. Now, remember. Well, actually, don't remember because we haven't done it yet. But a chemoreceptor is a sensory receptor that senses chemical changes. So it's a nerve cell, but it senses chemical changes, uh, and specifically in this case, drop in pH. And you got one set in the brain and the other set in the circulatory system, in the blood vessels. And essentially, what they do is they sense the level of carbon dioxide in the blood. Carbon dioxide mixed with water will form what's called carbonic acid. All right, that's why soda and beer are acidic, right? Because all those bubbles in there are forming carbonic acid. And so when the acid level changes your blood pH, makes it more acidic, so lowers the pH, these chemoreceptors sense that. And what they then do is they trigger the nervous system, the medulla oblongata, to make you breathe faster. All right, because interestingly enough, if you are asphyxiated, strangled, for example, and God help us, God forbid that ever happened, but when someone is strangled, the cause of death is not lack of oxygen, but rather the inability to get rid of the carbon dioxide. All right, people who have fallen into frozen lakes and things like that and have gone underneath the water, if they can drown but still be brought back 15 or even 20 minutes later, depending on the case and a variety of other factors, because they don't die because of lack of oxygen. All right, what happens to somebody who asphyxiates is they die because they can't get the carbon dioxide out of their systems. Their blood becomes very acidic, and that starts to eat through the capillary walls. As a matter of fact, most coroners, the first thing that they'll look at in a case where they think somebody may have been murdered is the eyes, because the capillaries in the eyes will burst. And so a deceased victim with bloodshot eyes is a sign that that person may have been strangled or asphyxiated in some way. So, all right. Now, let's get to the actual exchange of gases in the body, the actual respiratory process. So, the two gases, and you've probably known this since elementary school, the two gases that are exchanged in the body are oxygen and carbon dioxide. And interestingly enough, The exchange of gases is done strictly by diffusion. Now, what does that mean? That means there's no energy here. All right. The only energy expended in the process of respiration is during inspiration when the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm contract. All right. The actual exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide does not require any energy at all. Now, diffusion always occurs from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. So as long as you can produce a concentration gradient, these gases will exchange. They'll move. The one thing that most people don't really think about is that respiration does not only occur in the lungs. All right? Respiration is the exchange of these gases. And it actually happens in count them, two locations. All right. It occurs in the lungs or at the lungs, and that's what we refer to as external respiration. And this is the exchange of gases between the alveoli of the lungs and the blood capillaries that surround them. And in this position, obviously, oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood, and carbon dioxide is going to diffuse out of the blood. However, respiration also has to take place at every single cell in the body because every cell needs to take oxygen out of the blood and give oxygen away to the blood. And that's what we refer to as internal respiration. All right, so this is important. Respiration actually takes place in two different locations. One is, of course, the lungs. The other is every other cell in the body that exchanges oxygen and carbon dioxide with the bloodstream. Okay. Now, how does that work? All right. Well, this is a very uh, simple diagram, but it does a pretty good job at illustrating the two different exchanges. All right. External respiration occurs in the lungs. And what happens here is that blood from the right side of the heart comes up through the pulmonary artery and into the lungs. Now, remember, there are actually two pulmonary arteries. One goes to this lung and one goes to that lung. But in this case, we'll keep it simple and just make one capillary bed representing the lungs as a whole. Well, the blood coming from the pulmonary artery is very high in carbon dioxide because that blood has come from the body cells. It's also very low in oxygen because the oxygen is not there. And so when it gets to the lungs, two things are happening. All right, carbon dioxide is diffusing from the purple lined thing here. It represents the capillary, and you can see the carbon dioxide diffusing out of the capillary and into the alveolus. On the other hand, there's a higher concentration of oxygen on the outside, and so oxygen will diffuse from the alveolus to the blood. Okay, and so this exchange is occurring simultaneously. All right, so when you breathe in air that has a higher concentration of oxygen. And when you exhale, when you breathe out, that air has a lower concentration of oxygen. Now, it's not significantly lower, all right? It's not like what you breathe in is pure oxygen and what you breathe out is pure carbon dioxide. And your initial breath is about 21% oxygen. When you exhale, it's about 20% oxygen. So there's not there's a lot of oxygen molecules in each breath that you take. Now, so now the blood that is free of carbon dioxide but rich in oxygen runs down to the left side of the heart and then eventually out to the body cells. And in the capillary beds in the body cells, the opposite process now occurs. Oxygen-rich blood will give up its oxygen to the tissue cells, and carbon dioxide will diffuse out of the tissues and into the blood. All right, and so you can see the two different types of respiration. External occurs in the lungs, where oxygen moves from the alveoli to the blood, and carbon dioxide moves from the blood to the alveoli. And internal respiration, where oxygen moves from the blood to the tissues, and carbon dioxide moves from the tissues to the blood. Okay. Now, this, my friends, is a Mr. Anderson video on the respiratory system. And so when you come to the end of this video, which only has two more slides in it, please go to the PowerPoint and click on the link to this and have a look. All right, it'll review much of what we said here, but add a couple of new things in as well. All right, and the Mr. Anderson videos are always worth a good look. Okay, now with each of the systems, I try to mention certain things that can go wrong. All right, and so for the respiratory system, we'll talk about upper respiratory tract infections. Now, sinusitis is a blockage of the sinuses. If you've ever had a sinus infection, um, or your head just seems completely filled with snot and it gives you a headache, all right, that's probably sinusitis. Otitis media is an infection of the middle ear. And what this is essentially there are tubes that run from the inner ear to your throat. All right. Have you ever swallowed and had your ears pop? All right. Well, that's because there are tubes that lead from your throat to your inner ear, and they help to equalize the pressure. Well, if those tubes become infected and plugged up with mucus and everything else, you can't equalize that pressure, and it can become very painful. Now, this is far more common in infants and young kids than it is in adults. All right. Some of you may actually have had tubes inserted, little plastic or metal tubes inserted in your eustachian tubes to help keep those tubes open. Um, Infections in the middle ear are very common in small children. When the triplets were little, I would go to the pediatrician every 2 weeks for an ear infection. One kid would get it, then 2 weeks later, the next kid would get it, then 2 weeks later, the next kid would get it, and then 2 weeks after that, the first kid would get it again. And then we just spent all winter running to the pediatrician's office. Tonsillitis is inflammation of the tonsils. All right, remember, these are the lymphatic tissues at the back of your throat and the back of your nasal cavities. Um, uh, Back in my day, when I was your age, the most common treatment for tonsillitis was literally surgical removal of those. Right now, they tend to be treated medically with various antibiotics and that sort of thing. Last but not least is laryngitis, which is an infection of the voice box that can lead to loss of voice. If you've ever experienced laryngitis, you know that you don't even necessarily need a sore throat, right? It just is that the voice box has become infected and you're unable to produce proper sounds from it. Now, lower respiratory tract disorders tend to be far more serious than upper respiratory tract infections. Um, and by the way, COVID-19 is very dangerous because it leads to lower respiratory tract disorders, especially types of pneumonia. Now, pneumonia is an infection of the lungs with a thick fluid buildup. What this does is it blocks the alveoli and essentially prevents them from being able to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide effectively. And so this can be very dangerous. And this is one of the reasons why many COVID patients end up on respirators. Now, it's not COVID, I promise. Tuberculosis is a bacterial infection that leads to tubercles, little capsules produced by these bacteria in the alveoli. And again, this makes it difficult to breathe. Pulmonary fibrosis is a condition where the lungs lose their elasticity because a connective tissue builds up inside the lungs, typically because of inhaled particles like cigarette smoke or coal dust and that sort of thing. Emphysema is a similar condition. It's chronic, incurable. The alveoli become damaged, and therefore the surface area for gas exchange is diminished. Asthma is a condition where the bronchial tree becomes irritated and it causes breathlessness, wheezing, and coughing. My daughter has asthma, and I watch her struggle with it. And she's on her inhaler, or she does take a daily medication as well, a Singulair, or the generic version of it anyway. And there are different forms of asthma, but the symptoms are all relatively similar. And finally, on this list, lung cancer. All right, cancer is an uncontrolled cell division in the lungs, typically caused by smoking. which can lead to death. All right. Of all of these, lung cancer is probably the most preventable. Don't smoke. It's a fairly easy thing to not do. I mean, think about it. You roll up a plant leaf in little pieces in a piece of paper, stick it in your mouth, and light the other end on fire. How dumb can you be? But it is what it is. All right. Anyway, that, my friends, is the end of the second of two videos on the respiratory system, and I hope you learned something.